Well, by now, some of you, like a lot of you that follow these at all, have probably seen the trailer I put up for my NaNoWriMo entry and winner. Because it's true, I made over 50,000 words, 50,017 precisely, by November 30th at around 6 p.m. And it's my first time. Pretty good stuff, if I say so myself. Over 50,000 words, every bit of it right out of my ass. As I like to call it, the Lindelof-Cuse writing method. Speaking of which, I do apologize that my work on the lost videos slowed so much, but I seriously just did not have the time for much of it. I am pretty proud, pretty pleased that I got Two for the Road out, though, because, I've been waiting to say some of that stuff for a while. And I'm definitely planning on getting those out more quickly now that I have the time again. Although I am also probably going to be working on this because, like I said, Fools and Idiots, the book, I think, has some potential to it after a lot of cleanup, of course, because now that I have this kind of template to work from, I want to get an actual outline going and come up with an ending for this thing, because it's not, the story is far from over where I left off. I just got 50,000 words and stopped. But I now think that something nice to do would be to read off some of it for you good people right now, just to give you some idea of what's been taking up my time. Keep in mind, I am not considering this any kind of finished work. I'm sure a lot of it sounds like crap, and there are a few names in there that are obvious placeholders that I would not consider actually putting in a finished work submitted for publishing, but just bear with me. This is stuff that came right out of my head, and I will read it now. This is well, I didn't put chapters in it because I just wanted a pure story to count towards the word count, but these are the introductions to the 5 main characters that you read about in the trailer. And here we go right now. Somewhere this could all be happening right now. There is a star around which revolves 5 planets. The people who live here only know that they came from another place long ago. Anything else has been washed away into legend. The innermost planet is known as Agapios, and is occupied by those who presume to rule over all else. Its largest city is called Herod, and is the seat of power for the ruling class. The emperor's palace dwarfs all around it with a sparkling facade of white marble, and is the product of decades of labor. It was commissioned by Emperor Job I, who saw the building as the legacy he would leave behind as his family continued to rule forever. The result was horrific labors by uncountable slaves and many deaths from disease and starvation, as Job insisted on putting as much money as possible into the palace. The day it was completed, he proudly walked up the steps and into the main front door to observe the fruits of others' labor, where he was promptly killed by a loose ceiling tile. That night the emperor's family were all murdered as they slept, and their bodies displayed so many wounds from such a large array of implements that there was no way to tell what had actually killed them. No arrests were ever made, and the throne passed to a new family who had been waiting for just such an opportunity. The ruler at this particular time was Saturnine VI, the latest of a family that had held the throne for 10 generations, and today he was having a parade to celebrate his army's victory against the invaders from the second planet, Kleos. The victorious soldiers stretched as far as anyone could see, even in the highest seats levitated 30 feet off the ground. As the sun shone through the copper sky, their bright red uniforms made a stunning contrast with the white plaza in front of the palace. Gasps echoed around the crowd, most of all from the children, who were more fascinated with the men's weapons, able to shoot a meter-long hole through a concrete wall, but today safely deactivated. But one person in the crowd didn't care about any of it. He knew all about what was happening because he had trained and worked with the men currently being honored. Marcus Ordicus had finished his training for the Imperial Army with high honors and had greatly looked forward to the campaign against the invaders. Then he made the mistake of confiding his greatest secret to his best friend Jean. Marcus had been 13 years old when he first realized that he was attracted to other men, and he spent many years afterward hating himself for it. He did everything he could to try to banish that part of himself and had never discussed it with anyone before. In fact, the only reason he brought it up to Jean, Imperial soldiers were encouraged to only know each other by their first names to make them feel like a family of their own, was to ask if there were any other ways to do it. However, all his friend had noticed was that he had admitted his feelings, and Marcus promptly found himself getting his uniform torn off and thrown out of the army to the laughter and insults of his former family. He had spent that night in a bar and woke up to find himself in a strange man's bed. So now he had only come to do one thing, knowing he probably wouldn't get the chance to do it properly. And that indeed was the case, as the crowd was so thick that there was no way he would actually get to see any of his former comrades in the flesh without the money to buy a higher seat. So he forced himself to be satisfied with what he could get. He backed away enough to find an empty spot on the ground and spat in their direction. It wasn't much, but he didn't see how he could hope for anything more. The planet Kleos is a world devoted to intellectualism. It features a violet sky and many modest cities, whose inhabitants include great writers, artists, and composers. Mostly they are happy to keep to their own devices. However, they also have a standing army which can be brought to bear against any injustices their leaders may perceive. The latest of these was intelligence that Saturnine of Agapios had been planning to launch a new attack on the farthest world in the system, Eleutheria, the one planet that had managed thus far to stay out of the Empire's clutches, largely by virtue of its being so much farther than the others. Several emperors over the centuries had tried to conquer it, but inevitably found it not worth the effort, or so their propagandists said. Many on Kleos saw it differently, and rumors grew that the people of Eleutheria had a war machine like no other, which Agapios could not match. However, Emperor Saturnine saw this as nothing more than a lack of ambition on his predecessor's parts, and had been ruthlessly training his own warriors like none in living memory. The Kleos prince, his preferred title, Ari Sharif, was outraged by the men who had suffered for this army they would never see the rewards of, and declared that he would see it stop. Ares was an idealist who rode a wave of popularity with the citizens into office, but unfortunately that also meant a lack of political savvy. His advisors warned him the attempt could only end in disaster, and the imperial army was too much for them, and they had been proven right. The loss of Kleosian life was so stunning that Ares quickly surrendered, and now everywhere on Kleos, Agapian soldiers forcibly kept the peace as they would for the foreseeable future. Idris Khoury was suffering the effects right now on his way to school. He and his sister Ariana had been stopped by a pair of soldiers whose intentions couldn't be more clear. Ariana had just started to come into her womanhood, and the direction of their gaze couldn't have been more obvious. Idris hoped that looking was all they were after. As her older brother, even if only by a year, he would feel bound to defend her honor, which could only end with him unconscious or dead, while Ariana suffered the men's attention anyway. But even knowing this, he knew that he couldn't stand by and do nothing. Running was out of the question as well, for if they ran into these two again, and in a town this small there was no reason to think they wouldn't, the results would likely be twice as bad. Luckily, they moved on, and Idris let go of the fists he found he had been making. Ariana faced him, looking terrified. I know, he said, but it's over now. No, it isn't. As long as they're here, it can happen any time they want, or worse than that. Idris sighed. I would do anything for you, you have to know that, but there's nothing I can do about this. Ariana wiped the tears from her eyes. We'd better get going. Neither noticed the people across the street who had seen the whole thing with vested interest. The third planet is Kratos, which is ruled by a democratically elected body. While technically also a part of the Empire, they practice a policy of isolation from others' affairs, and most of the time Agapios has been content to leave them alone, able to easily draw on the other's subjects for anything they need. This has led to insular businesses that have grown rich on their own currency, but finding people from other places to accept it is an uphill battle. Johann Eisenhower's father Conrad ran Kinda, one of the planet's most popular vehicle companies. They created everything from farming equipment to orbital cargo ships, and while their lack of specialization had led to complaints that none of their products were anything special, their sheer range allowed by slowly growing the company's net worth over decades ensured that there would always be buyers. Conrad had spent his son's entire life teaching him about the business, expecting that he would take over when the time came. But Johann never had the heart to tell him his heart wasn't in what they did. After spending 20 years on a world apart from any other and knowing there were others out there, he wanted to get out and see them. He would often look up at the night sky, accented by the planet's 3 moons, and wonder how he might see the other places out there he had gotten his father to tell him about on occasion. Now he was doing his time as a salesman, showing off Kinda's newest cargo ship, while desperately trying to hide his boredom. It'll make a trip around the equator in 3 hours. Naturally, in space, it'll go much faster. No matter where you want things to go in the world, this will get them there as fast as you want." The man he was talking to held up a hand. "I'm sorry, but I believe you're under a misconception. I'm looking for something that can ferry between here and Agapios." Johann wasn't quite sure he'd heard right. He struggled to come up with a way to respond to that and finally decided honesty would be best. His father couldn't exactly fire him after all. "Well, none of our stuff has really been tested for something like that. You don't get a lot of people here doing off-world business after all." The man smiled. "Oh, I'm well aware of that, which means there's a market no one has tapped yet, and I intend to be the first to do it. Now, you seem like a smart man, so tell me, what would be your best guess as to whether your stuff can suit my needs?" He had no idea what to say. "Well, space is space no matter how far you go, so I guess that shouldn't be a problem." The man put his hand up. "Okay, clearly you're not comfortable talking about this. In fact, you don't seem very comfortable with this whole job." To Johann's shocked look, he went on, "I make it my job to know people, to judge their emotions, and you definitely don't like this job, do you?" Johann shrugged. "It's a family business, so it's something waiting for me. It's nice to have that kind of security. But what if there was something better?" Johann didn't reply. "My name is Sartorius, and I may just have an opportunity for you if you want it." Next is Typhoeus, a gas giant orbited by 2 moons, Castor and Pollux. Both are inhabited, and the citizens have an amicable relationship for some years. But when the Empire conquered them, the new rulers feared what might result from both sides being willing to fight back. And so they created a strategy to turn each moon against the other, allowing one advantage to deny the other, until resentment became so great that none could even remember when they had once been friends. Then, when the time was right, the momentum would shift to the other moon, and so the 2 people are kept in a continual hatred of each other rather than their true oppressors. Sabore Kone had lived all of his 30 years on Castor, taught by his parents and teachers to hate everything about Pollux. Through all that time, he was thankful that he didn't need to ever think about them more than that. The last battle between the 2 sides had ended years before his birth, and everyone applauded its success in driving them away, though on occasion Sabore couldn't help but wonder if that was exactly what the Polluxians had wanted too. Whenever that happened, he would also find himself desiring a new war. He couldn't comprehend of a people as uniformly evil as he was taught, and he wanted to meet just one to see it for himself. He didn't think that what he had been told would be proved wrong, because how could so many people be so completely wrong, but he just had to know for his own curiosity how it was possible. Right now he was busy on the family farm. It was harvest season, and his family had many acres that needed to be tended. Everyone likes to say they have a harder job than anyone else, but Sabore knew he was telling the truth about it. These days there were plenty of chores to keep him occupied from dawn till dusk, but he couldn't complain because everyone else in the family and all their employees were working just as hard as him. His father Lorado had been killed years ago by a malfunctioning tractor. Sabore himself had found the body horribly mangled by the giant wheels. Ever since, he had a new appreciation for how important taking care of his equipment was. The worst was seeing the toll it took on his mother Lamekia, who took it upon herself to absorb the majority of the tasks her husband had brought to the farm. It killed Sabore to see her bury her grief in the work, but it worked for her, so who was he to say no? The corn swaying in the breeze always helped to calm him down, whenever violent thoughts were stirring in his head, but for some reason it wasn't working today. It had been a long time since he harbored any thoughts about leaving the farm, and he had long since accepted that it was his heritage and his to take care of. That was all he had asked out of life. But this day life took a different turn. In the distance he noted movement through the corn stalks. A faint sound reached him on the wind, sounding vaguely like a scream. Then a figure encased in black armor appeared in front, a club in his hand. Suddenly he was grabbed from behind, and the club was raised to come down in a killing blow. The word Pollux briefly flashed through his mind, but then nothing happened. Sabore opened his eyes to see another man, slightly more formal look to his armor, wave the attacker off. "This one's young and strong," came a tinny voice from inside the dark helmet. "They'll be better of use alive. Shame there were so few others like him at this place." Sabore's world collapsed in an instant. The man couldn't have meant his mother, all his siblings dead. He raked his mind, trying to think if any would hold the same appeal as him, but came up empty. The revelation was too big for him to comprehend, and he found he couldn't even cry as a pair of painful metal cuffs were attached to his wrists and he was led away. Eleutheria has a far wider orbit than any of the other worlds, and only comes into relatively close contact with them twice a year. This makes the inhabitants very mysterious to those on the other worlds, and the subject of a good deal of conflicting urban legends. It had become something of a sport over the years to try to top the last one you had heard. The truth was, it was a world with a very limited habitable range. The entire human population lived near the equator, as the rest of the world was far too cold to support life for long. Even there, the citizens had developed many heating devices to help them get through the day. It was a hard world to live on and produced hard people. People that had beaten back the Agapian Empire every time it had attacked, the only planet in the system that could boast of such a feat. This was the source of a great deal of local pride, though many who lived there also didn't exactly care much for anyone else who the Empire had victimized. They were content living their own lives without a care for anyone else's. On Eleutheria, it was said, your own life was hard enough, so why get others involved? Not everyone thought like this, however. One of these was Jingfei Zhou, daughter of the local magistrate Yuan. In her early life, she had been fascinated by news reports of what was happening in the inner planets and developed a distinct distaste for many of the policies enacted by Agapios. Now was her 18th birthday when she was legally recognized as an adult capable of making her own decisions about her life. Now if she could only convince her parents of that. Absolutely not, roared her father in a rage that shook his entire walrus-like face. Where do you get these ideas? If you were a boy, maybe, but you can't possibly expect this to end anyway except you're being killed or coming back here in disgrace. Jingwei subconsciously looked towards her mother as she replied, This is the one thing I feel would make my life mean something. Even if it ends as badly as you think, I would be happy knowing that I tried. To not try to make a difference when I know what's going on out there is the one thing I couldn't possibly live with. Yuan turned to his wife as well. Bao Yu, dear, maybe you can talk some sense into the girl where I cannot. Bao Yu's grave face seemed to tower over Jingwei as she said, You are just one person. No matter how hard you try, how much can you possibly do? Jingwei had expected this approach and prepared for it. I can gather more people. I can get the word out so that more will take up my cause. That may not sound like much, but it's what I've been dreaming of for years now. The dream of a child, grumbled Yuan. If you are as grown as you believe, you would see this idea for the nonsense it is. She shook her head. I had expected all of this and thought, though it hurts, I know what I must say now. Nothing that has happened in this room matters. It's my decision as the law states, the law that you uphold, Father. If I want to, there is nothing you can do to stop me. She thought she could see her father go slightly cross-eyed at the statement. But can't you see I just want you to be safe? I love you, I always have. What more can I say? Jingwei wanted to see this as just a trick, one last attempt to play in her sympathies. Unfortunately, she knew full well how genuine her father's statement was, and what she had to do got all the harder. I have made my decision, that is all that matters. You can accept it or not, but I am going. I will do all I can to expose the crimes of the Agapian Empire and inspire its people to rise up. I can only hope that one day you can see that this is the proper thing. Without another word, she turned around and left the room. Her ship was waiting, and with it whatever destiny had in store.